Hello, and thank you for clicking into our collective liberation by joining this currency justice conversation. Really excited to get to talk through the properties of money, the history of money, and explore how it intersects with our social justice and environmental justice movements. We don't often take the time to talk about the invention of money and the properties that it has and how it's designed. But I believe that it's actually very important to all of our movements and may in fact be essential in order to achieve food access and housing access and economic security as a whole at a community-wide scale, that we understand and change some of the core properties of currencies so that we're not having repeating patterns of systemically reinforced poverty. If you're in any movement for collective liberation, this talk is for you. I'm very, very grateful to be here. My name is Alex, and I use they and she pronouns. We're going to be starting because currencies and finance and economics can be so cerebral. We're going to start with presence and mindfulness and an experience in our bodies. We're going to start by finding a position that is comfortable, and if you have it in your space, find something that connects you with a sense of nature. Perhaps a houseplant or a window that you might be able to find. If you're finding that in your own body, in the touch of your hands, that is also nature. And as you find connection with this piece of nature where you feel comfortable, where you can come into connection with yourself and with the larger world in some way, I invite you to take a deep breath in and slowly release it a little bit longer than the inhale was. Continue to breathe as you feel your relationship with this piece of nature. Sit with the word itself, relationship. Think back, invite whichever of your ancestors had the most healthy and intact relationships with land, with food, with water, and with each other. What might that time and place have been like? Feel how the nature of that space, that time, that health is preserved in a way in this piece of nature you're in contact with. And bring to mind how it's also preserved in your relationships with those you love now. Think of the people who you most feel safe and loved with. What are those connections like? I invite you to come back to an awareness of your breath becoming a little bit deeper as you remember the details and rest into the feelings that are evoked by these healthy connections with loved ones and trusted ones. And as you breathe into these relationships with other people, also bring to mind your relationship with the plants in this world. And invite a curiosity about how those plants relate with the sunlight. What is that relationship like? Perhaps you're in a place where you can feel sunlight warming your skin or your room. Allow your awareness to follow how sunlight becomes life-affirming energy through photosynthesis in the leaves of plants and blades of grass and small cells of algae in the ocean. Feel how this life-affirming energy becomes sugars for the plants to thrive and food that the whole ecosystem needs. And feel also how that energy is stored in clear oxygen in the air. And come back to your breath, becoming even deeper as you breathe in this oxygen, which carries this energy from the sunlight. Feel how this energy refreshes your body, how it circulates to all your muscles and organs. Feel how this energy flows through the whole ecosystem, the same way it circulates through your bloodstream. How plants and animals all thrive by passing along this energy that came from the sun. And feel the beauty in how this energy is gradually used up, making space for the new sunlight and sugar and energy, which is constantly entering our bodies and ecosystems. Exhale the carbon dioxide that just came from this energy circulating through your body, refreshing all of your tissues and utilizing all of the energy that it's stored. Let this exhale go and make space for the new. Continue to follow this cycle through each breath. Feel how this matches the circulation of energy through all of our surroundings, how the energy cycles through ecosystems and through our individual bodies. Match. Allow this circulation to nourish every piece of what we truly cherish and value. What do you choose to value? What do you choose to cherish? What matters the most to you? What affirms life the most? What supports your community the most? Feel this energy circulating through the whole system, making it exactly where it needs to go to nourish these most central priorities. Cherish how this nourishes all life on earth. And cherish the process in your own time and way of completing and reflecting upon this experience. As you do, I invite, if you would like to pause the video, to offer the possible reflection of exploring through writing or art or self-expression of any form, how everything that we need to know to heal towards intact, egalitarian, connective, and equitable economic systems is constantly being modeled within nature and within our own bodies. Feel free to take the time to reflect on how you carry this blueprint everywhere you go. And when it's right for you, start to wiggle your toes, massage your hands a little bit, find a place where your spine feels comfortable to continue watching through this conversation and reflecting in your own ways, perhaps sharing in dialogue with others as you go. And we will move into today's talk. We're going to be focusing on a framework of 4 spaces of focus within the world of currency justice. And currency justice in this case is being defined as the specific collective liberation process and movement for how the properties of currencies, the nature of currencies, and changes to those properties and the systems built around them can be part of our collective liberation, of our social, racial, economic, and environmental justice movements as a whole. We're not talking today specifically about how money is used or made. We're talking instead about changing the game of what money is, what properties it has, and why it has those properties, and what the impacts are upon community. To start, we're going to be diving into the history of money and the culture that has both shaped that process of its invention, as well as the culture of how we use it. We're going to touch on how money is created and how it's introduced to circulation, how money leaves circulation, and what money is made to represent. In this case, money and currencies are used very broadly in ways that are different from many other contexts. We're specifically talking about anything that is used to symbolically represent real value. This broad definition is broad on purpose. We want that explorations that we're going to go on to apply to everything from perhaps the US dollar to an exploration of the justices and injustices of newer digital currency technologies, as well as individual localized credit systems, hourly currencies for time banks, and many different innovations in the space of money economics and currencies themselves. We want to have a very broad approach to this with an emphasis on social and environmental well-being and liberation towards the future. In service of that, we're going to start with a statement for acknowledgement and commitment to justice movement around how we engage with currencies. Currency justice falls within the realms of solidarity economics and regenerative economics. Those are words used in relatively recent times to represent something that is not relatively recent. These movements are part of and still ideally connected right in with ongoing and multifaceted sets of movements, prioritizing social and ecological well-being as cornerstones of transforming our systems. And these movements have always been and should continue to be led by those who are most connected to pre-colonial lifeways, as well as those who have been most oppressed by the destructive systems that have been imposed by colonization and capitalism, especially BIPOC communities, where indigenous knowledge and pre-colonial knowledge has survived for many generations under extreme oppression and the exploitation of labor and of culture. And it's really important that all of this movement happens in a way that is deeply centered on racial justice and intercultural reparations as we dismantle white supremacy. I acknowledge that I am coming to this particular work as a white-bodied person. I am coming as a trans feminine person, as someone who grew up in the middle class. And all of those inform a positionality that I can bring certain strengths to the table and opportunities and the privilege that I have to be able to step into transforming and dismantling systems of oppression that claimed me as their beneficiary without my consent, where I was born into a world where money has been used for many thousands of years to control, oppress, and ultimately lead into exactly the scenario we see now, where exploitation is the norm. And instead of having relationships with each other and with land and with community, most legal structures in dominant society right now are built out around the culture of money and the culture of ownership, exchange and sales and profit. And it's really important to dismantle that back towards relationship. That is intact and healthy relationship. My story does not come through conventional economics, and I'm not here to pretend to be some expert in the academic fields that connect with this work. I come more as a community member and initially a food systems advocate who found my way into that through mental health and working with youth who were in residential treatment settings. That work was very, very passion based for me. And I saw youth coming through this treatment facility where I was employed, where they were being diagnosed and treated as the problem, when really they were responding to intergenerational and systemic issues, including ecological dread, including race-oriented economic oppression, including so many different forms of systemic issues. And I tried going upstream of that and found my way into food systems and food access. I had the incredible privilege of working as a volunteer coordinator within a community of about 2,000 volunteers per year, providing their labor for free to help feed a community of about, when I started, around 42,000 households, which eventually became, over the course of the 2 years I was in that position, about 60 to 70,000 households, providing free food, free groceries, free meals. And it put me into contact both with direct lived experiences, where I had the incredible privilege and honor of getting to know individuals and their stories, really getting to see, again, that the systems were the issue, where people were being treated as the problem, as if they weren't working hard enough, or as if they weren't taking initiative enough, as if they were just lazy or undeserving, as the cultural narrative for why hunger existed, when really these were people working extensive hours, harder than most people who are food secure would even imagine or consider, and people who interfaced directly with many intersecting facets of systems of oppression, including those of ableism and racism and gender injustice. I also had the opportunity to be working in a food bank that was large enough that I interfaced also with some level of policy and larger food systems supply chain issues. And because I was working with volunteers who performed some tasks within all departments of the food bank, it put me into contact with all of those parts of operation. And it was a crash course in what's not working systemically. And I tried going upstream again. I went upstream into policy and advocacy work. And I do still do work in policy and advocacy. There are still very needed changes in that realm in order to make it possible for lasting change to occur. But I also found, again, all of these upstream issues that led to money, where the movement of money and the control of money and the nature of our financial system controlled which policies were passed and which weren't, which causes had lobbying power, which candidates had super PAC support. All of these different components of the system intersected in a way that led me to know that in order for systems to change, whether it's at a direct on the ground level like I was experiencing at that food bank, or whether it's through policy change at larger infrastructural and social levels, money's still holding the reins, and it tends to direct on the ground well-intentioned support into the nonprofit industrial complex of this chronic band-aid solution, while directing policy world towards pointing fingers across the aisle for problems that don't really have a solution on either side because the issue is the system itself. So that's what we're going to touch on today. And we're going to start with a reflection. In person, this would be dynamic conversation, and I hope that you have someone in your life who you can have this conversation with. Feel free also to reflect independently on systems themselves and what you dream of for a lasting, liberated world or a well world. And many of us have been so ingrained in systems of oppression that it has internalized itself to the extent that we don't actually feel the possibility anymore. And I invite you to hold just the maybe possibility that there is the possibility of a system, a future that is well, where people are well, where the planet is well. And I invite you to take some notes, find some ways to remember what that world is that you want to see, as well as the barriers that you're facing on the way to getting there, where you might find obstacles, where there might be very big hurdles that need to be crossed in order to make it to that world from here. And I invite you to specifically reflect on which of those barriers and systems and which of those futures are impacted and influenced by money or impeded by money. The call to action here is to know that money itself is the limiting factor in many different forms of liberatory work, where we need to understand and change the properties of currencies to solve many of these systems level problems. And for many of us, this is the first time in our lives, the first era of our movements, when we're becoming aware of the fact that the properties of currencies themselves might have to change in order for us to get there. We're going to start where money started, which, interestingly, is somewhat unknown. The first writing that we find in the oldest clay tablets in Mesopotamia near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are already talking about some forms of trade, media of exchange, and units of account. And we find that documentation between 4,500 and 5,000 years ago, where we see the first documentation of especially food being used to facilitate wide-scale trade, as well as used to measure debts and the amount that's owed for particular crimes. There's a lot of different ways that this is recorded, but we see it in its oldest form there. And especially barley grain was particularly prevalent in that first documentation, where units called silas, approximately about a liter of barley grain, was the unit of measurement for essentially being a currency at the same time as a food source, which is actually sort of brilliant because you're trading something that everybody needs. And if you're not needing it as a currency, you can use it as food. Or if you need food, you can go and make money and then you've got that food. It's a very interesting way to have trade be mediated. It has a lot of benefits, actually, that we'll talk about later in the math of how it interacts with the physics of our energy systems, the flow of energy through ecosystems and communities. But it comes from an even more important, in my argument, even more important cultural shift that occurred in that area following the widespread adoption of agriculture, where we see evidence of agriculture being widespread much earlier, actually, than we see any evidence or documentation of money. And again, we don't know exactly when or how that first idea emerged because it already existed at the time that we see documentation of it. And it was originally things that were not going to last in archaeological sites. And so we have some guessing work to do, but what we can see documented in concrete ways is a large scale cultural transition away from hunter gatherer lifestyles towards working the land, especially in these very rich, um, in the presence of these very rich and abundant rivers, where agriculture became more culturally normalized. And one of the things that, again, is soft hypothesis, and for me, something that I want to be transparent is largely my own speculation. I actually believe that the root of what we see as our current dominant culture, what became colonial culture eventually, happened with the invention of a particular kind of relationship style and relationship agreement during that cultural transition. And this is the transition from mutual relationship and animism, an understanding of relationship with the land as being important to your own survival, and mutualism and symbiosis with other species and plants and people, towards this concept of a relationship model called ownership. It is something that we see not being very widespread and successful in pre-colonial cultures. It's something that tends to get shut down in a lot of tighter knit um, non-monetary communities because it is a completely unilateral relationship. The idea of ownership itself divests one member of this relationship, whether it's a human being and an object, or a human being and land, or a human being and another person. It completely divests one member of that relationship of all of their rights and autonomy as the property of the other member of the relationship, the owner. It is so destructive that between human beings, it is slavery. And it is documented in the same texts as the first history of money that we see, that it is also a time when women, especially, as well as individuals from outside of those particular communities, so people who were racially and culturally separate from that cultural identity in those parts of Sumer, along the Euphrates River, especially in some of that first documentation, those people are being treated as property in the first full documentation that we have. And that is the cultural context also for the invention of money. Because when ownership exists, you start having a different way that value moves through a community. In our meditation at the start, we touched on healthy relationship. And when you have, for example, a household where everyone knows and loves and supports each other, if there's a child that's sick, the parent is going to give them cold medicine without them having to work for it. You can rest and heal and get the medicine you need. Where there is need, the support and value goes to meet it. That's what happens in intact relationships. You don't need money in intact relationships. You only need money once those relationships have been broken or there is a loss of trust and mutualism and the free flow of energy. And when ownership exists, it locks down where value is and it changes the win condition for economics. Prior to the invention of ownership, the win condition for economics is for your community and your surroundings to be thriving. That is the win condition for that game. But with ownership introduced, there's a different win condition introduced, which is to accumulate as much as possible, which is why I argue that that is culturally the birth of colonial ideology, because it would be that mindset that says, I'm going to own this land that I farm and these people who farm it. And that ideology spreading out. But how do you get what you need and give what you need if it's owned? It restricts it to either it has to be sold or exchanged, it has to be gifted at a loss, or it has to be loaned. That's incredibly restrictive, and it's entirely based, even the idea of a gift in our modern cultural interpretation is rooted in this ideology that ownership is the legal bedrock of all relationship, that something is owned by default, and the gift is a change in ownership. That didn't exist before. There were affiliations, there was connection. You could have a committed relationship without it being exploitative. The idea of ownership divesting a committed connection, whether it's with a ceremonial object or a person or a place, divesting that being of their rights was a novel invention at the time. And that's really important for us to repair in our collective liberation work and in the construction of any healthy future model of money. Money itself scaled this system tremendously, because if you're trading something, let's say you've got someone who makes hats and someone who makes boots, there's a concept that in its fancy terminology is the mutual coincidence of wants, or the mutual coincidence of needs, which is actually very rare. And what it means is person A wants what person B makes at the exact same time and in the exact same quantity as person B wants what person A makes. It's actually very rare. And so barter systems based off of ownership did not really work at all in any infrastructural scale until the invention of the first media of exchange. And again, the first ones that we see are those forms of barley grain, which also was recorded with equivalency to other forms of food, and as well as animals, livestock, who started again at that same time to be treated as the property of individual men. Everything was associated as property of individual men. That progressed over time to the point where those media of exchange that were food and that were grown started to be being grown not by the people who initially consolidated power, where it was the case that they were the ones who controlled the land, so they were the ones who controlled the barley. It started to be that those people got so many people working for them that they had them build a palace somewhere and became the first kings in the first kingdoms, where instead of them growing the food, it was then a ring around this palatial city where others were growing the food, and they no longer controlled the monetary system. And around that time, we see the introduction of metals as currency. That is something that occurred more recently in history, between 2,500 and 3,500 years ago. That was something that shifted a lot of how money worked, because previously, if a community needed more wealth, if there was a time of communal poverty, the solution was literally to grow more abundance for the community, to grow more food, and it met people's needs more adaptively to have that older system. Introducing metal as money made it very different. And instead of growing abundance whenever there was scarcity, The requirement was to provide your labor to those in power. And that labor was rewarded with this relatively permanent thing that couldn't be eaten, wasn't generally otherwise usable. The ability to shape it yourself into something else made of metal was limited to those with significant, at the time, technology and privilege. And then you would pay it back for the fulfillment of your needs. And it was that that introduced this cycle of recurrent debt, because the money, for the first time, was something permanent, while all human needs are only met for a temporary amount of time at a time. Whether it's food or housing that needs to be repaired, or water that you need more of throughout the day, or medical care that is needed over time, multiple times. All of those are recurring costs, but instead of the energy coming into the ecosystem and meeting those in a way that naturally matched the energy flows of ecosystems with the energy flows of, like, barley grain, for example, you've got a holder of the monetary system who controls the issuance and amount and type of money that you have to provide your labor to over and over and over again. Any permanent currency is a technology for decentralized indentured servitude to those who hold the most. It is a very destructive way of capitalizing entropy, where the natural flow of the second law of thermodynamics falls into basically just a pattern of debt, where you need to provide your labor over and over for daily, weekly, monthly wages. And that's the start of the sort of wage economy built into the technology of currencies. This is really important for our movements to understand, because money is often spoken about as a neutral thing that can be used well or used poorly. We need to also understand that while, yes, the flow of value through a community, housing, food, care, that is just energy moving, and it can move where it's needed or where it's not, we need to have the simultaneous understanding that even while we're operating with the best that a corrupt system has given us, we need to understand the limitations, nature, and properties of the system of money as being invented to create ongoing debt, and being a technology for specifically institutionalizing indentured labor. The technology of money was made to scale the culture of ownership and colonialism, and it did that across primarily Europe. Interestingly, many cultures did resist it. We do see some stories which may be linked to the transitions. For example, we have the surviving documentation of stories about the transition, or at least that we can speculate are likely about the transition from a grain-based currency into gold. For example, with Rumpelstiltskin, where the main character of the story, has to basically live up to this false claim by her father that she could spin straw into gold. And this mysterious figure, Rumpelstiltskin, who does transform straw into gold, and how it builds wealth and it builds sort of temporary security for this main character, but she's always having to give something in return. Initially, she's giving objects and keepsakes, but eventually Rumpelstiltskin says, in order to transform this next batch of hay, straw, grain into gold, you've got to give your unborn child to me. And at that point, the only way that she can break that is to learn his name. She finds him out in the Forrest like bragging about how no one will ever learn his name. And by naming him, Rumpelstiltskin breaks the pattern and frees herself from the debt of having to give her unborn child. That particular story can be interpreted so many different ways, and there are so many better tellers who take much more time than I have in this talk and conversation to really breathe life into it. But it's interesting to consider, what if that is one of the first currency justice stories, where storytellers preserve this moment of grain and straw literally transitioning from being the main system into gold being the main system, and how we have to literally name that process, or else it will take the next generations. It will consume the next generations. And it is the sort of cultural understanding that people probably would have felt during that time, where their own autonomy over their community's economies was taken. And there was great power that was offered in exchange. There was great privilege and the consolidation of wealth. There was a lot of control, but at the cost of the future, at the cost of the next generation's well-being and livelihood and survival. That impact continues today. And we still use currencies that are based off of those 2,000 to 5,000 year old technologies, where they continue to have these same systemic dysfunctions that they were invented to perpetuate. We need to acknowledge this in the open across all of our movements. We need to say it. We need to say Rumpelstiltskin. We need to call out the need for currency justice and currency change. Cultural change is economic change at the bedrock of it. Our cultures, our laws, and our communities have all been influenced or shaped, or at the very least impacted and attacked by money. And money has been shaped by that cultural story, very likely tracing back to an old ancestral wound, where emotionally someone felt they could not trust their community, or there was such a rupture in relationship with land and with community and with animals and with nature as a whole, that someone would even invent the concept of ownership, that maximized exploitation of a member of a relationship. It's absolutely abhorrent in the context of if you imagined that happening in your own household. And it's the same thing, but it happened at a broad cultural scale. It's something that, if you look at it through the context of Christian religious texts, what Christ flipped tables about. We need to understand that the initial reparation of the cultural healing has to be what precedes any systemic change. Otherwise, if we go in without doing the inner work, we're going to create new systems that just perpetuate the same old wounds, the same old trauma. And this is my ancestral trauma. It is the ancestral trauma behind so many parts of capitalism and white supremacy. And it is my opportunity as someone born into that ongoing system to illuminate and dismantle it and work towards collective liberation, where we have intact relationships with each other. Thinking forward, we do want different cultural agreements to be what shapes our economies. And there may be many at small scales that work perfectly well and should work perfectly well without money at all. Money itself is something that effectively serves to pass relationship agreements around a large-scale community that's bigger than the ability to know each other, once you get beyond several hundred people, you're not dealing with someone you know closely. You're in a community where some people are just the idea of a person. And doing trade with them at even the scale of a few thousand, let alone a few billion people globally, it takes some form of infrastructure that needs to be based on some form of fundamental understanding, beliefs, and agreements. And I believe that those agreements should match those found in healthy human relationships. This is something that's found in families that are working together, intact communities of faith who support each other through hard times. It's the way that we operate when we actually know a person, place, or thing that we care about, is that needs are prioritized and met. We want to build systems based on that belief. That care is something that is intrinsically deserved by human beings and other than human beings. That is something that we want to build our systems to reflect and protect between people and each other, between people and the planet. And we want to deepen into an understanding of building systems to prioritize what we actually want to value. And I would say, ideally, that it would be beautiful to be in a system without currencies at all. But in order to get there from a place where our culture really is addicted to money, we need to have fundamental change at such a core level that also has a safe and steady path to get from point A to point B, which in my mind ideally is free of money at all. But money is something that we can use as a tool to break that addiction when we change its properties. And there's very specific ways that we can do that in ways that reflect changing the game, to pass intact relationships around instead of passing ownership around, and to be able to prioritize and fund what we authentically want to fund as communities with consent and community leadership at the helm. And in order to understand how to do that, we're going to dive into scratching the surface of currency properties. These are things that you can spend a very long time exploring, studying, and building out. We're going to scratch the surface today, and I invite everyone who has any interest in this to please write about it, talk about it, share it with your friends and family, lean into how your business, your organizations, your community organizing movements can lean into having currency justice as part of social and environmental justice movements as a whole. In our current system, most people are told money doesn't grow on trees. Very early in life, that is one of the common statements across capitalist culture. There are, I'm sure, idioms in other languages as well that correspond, where there's an idea that money is earned, not created. But that's only true for people who are providing wage labor. In our current system, the issue of how money is introduced by whom, where, and when falls under the purview of what is called monetary policy. It's overseen by central banks under that monetary policy, and those central banks authorize private banks to issue money out of thin air whenever they make loans. This is the realm of monetary reform movements, which have been long-standing. For example, mentioned in Nobel Prize winner Frederick Soddy's book from about 100 years ago, Wealth, Virtual Wealth, and Debt, the Solution to the Economic Paradox. And resources will be in the description of this video, as well as citations for so much of this. He mentions in the conclusion of the book the need to transition away from bank money creation systems. This is something that has been known for a long time, and it's been the way that money has been created since the Bank of England first started using any checking as their process for issuing loans. Money started to be a number instead of a physical thing. And that continues. But not many people know that that's what happens. That money is not just held by the bank and then loaned out from what they hold. There's a fractional reserve where they hold a little bit, but then they can make a lot of a loan out of thin air with that little bit of reserve. And there's nothing to say that that bit of reserve didn't come from another loan that was taken out of thin air somewhere else. And so our whole system operates with essentially money that has been invented as private bank credit. That money in our current system goes to people who take out loans. And it's a very inflationary process of money being created, especially since in the last century, the United States unilaterally decided that it would be legal under monetary policy to do that for speculative purchases. For example, real estate, where money is invented out of thin air to purchase property. The new money in circulation ramps up the price of that. It's been invented out of nowhere. And then sales can be made for a profit. And it's something where someone can get that money that didn't exist beforehand for anything where they believe they can make a return to pay back to the bank. This has so many widespread impacts. There are ways that it does provide the flexibility for people who are considered creditworthy to be able to have the ability to afford things they otherwise wouldn't. However, who is considered creditworthy has always been an avenue for discrimination. And this has been a highly impactful mechanism of white supremacy, giving loans and printing money out of thin air for people who match the idea of the wealthy. In this case, white people, especially in the US. That is something that really ramped up with so many places restricting the ability for loans to go based on redlining, based on racialized neighborhood analysis, and race factoring into whether someone was considered deserving of a loan has had so many intergenerational impacts that are incredibly devastating. This has also funded a lot of acts of war. Nazi Germany did not have any money to fund the death machine that they became. They invented it. German banks just issued money out of thin air to fund all of those atrocities. And who has access to this is a really important thing to consider. As so many people become aware of this, there's a movement towards separatism that has manifested in many cryptocurrency movements, a large amount of those being influenced by libertarian ideology. That is something where people don't want anyone controlling where their money is, where it comes from, where it goes. Have that be something that is taken care of on a network. And it has itself become something where it is highly restrictive, very racially determined, especially along gender lines as well, for who has the power to issue that form of money to. And in so many of those cases, those currencies also have really, really intensive energy use and environmental impact consequences, as well as a lot of ethical ramifications around what happens when they're used to fund things that are similarly exploitative or devastating towards individuals, places, people, or communities as a whole, or power grids as a whole. Another thing that's important to mention here that I mention in the section around the creation of money is something that the creation of money for future systems might be able to address. And this is market reinforced systemic poverty. Now, supply and demand is the bedrock of capitalism. It is the idea that when more people want something, the price goes up, and more people want to provide it when the price goes up, and therefore, when more people want something, there's more of the thing. And when fewer people want something, there's less of the thing. And it works okay for luxury purchases. If people are, wanting a bigger TV, that price is something where they're going to balance, what's my budget versus how much do I want it versus how much do these other people want it, how many are available based on how many people want to buy it. That can work okay. But one important thing about supply and demand is that it requires demand that's based upon competition between buyers. If there's no competition between buyers, there isn't a price for something. That's not appropriate for basic need fulfillment. Any time you're talking about basic well-being and survival, when you're talking about the cheapest affordable rent in an area, when you're talking about the minimum cost for food in an area, you're talking about need, not desirability. Demand is based on a combination of how many people need something and how much they can pay for it. But it's not ever going to be based on, oh, I'd like to survive, but I can do without that. People are going to spend as much as they need to survive if they have to. And what that unfortunately does is it makes it impossible to solve poverty using our existing currency and market systems. This is at the bedrock of why I, as someone who was passionate about food access and mental health, even got anywhere close to studying money. Because changing some of these properties of money can provide the opportunity to actually solve this mathematical problem. But in its current state, anytime there's a price for something that's a part of basic survival, basic well-being, because scarcity is required in a supply and demand balance, poverty is also chronically preserved by markets in a way that no nonprofit, no tax scheme, no generosity in terms of volunteerism can ever stop, because that is the stabilizing factor for how minimum prices in markets work. Because of that, we need systems where basic well-being is accessible outside of supply and demand based market systems. If we want entire communities to be secure, that is the realm of solutions that we have to look into. And using any currency where you are exchanging something for getting your basic needs met, that, when it is competitive, will always lead to chronic scarcity, chronic poverty existing across a society. Any financial or monetary or currency system that we build in the future needs to acknowledge this and needs to work in a way that acts separately from supply and demand when we're talking about basic needs. Thinking forward, we can get really inventive about how we want money to enter circulation. This can be something that's considered at the level of local currencies, or something that we consider at the level of central bank digital currencies that are more mainstream. There's a lot of opportunities right now at this point in history to decide how we as communities want money to enter circulation. And I believe the first thing we've got to focus on is having it be a priority that our systems fund essential activities for providing universal basic access. That housing and food and water, education, the basis for well-being, the things that people deserve as basic rights within any community that is committed to providing that, you've got to design a currency system that's built around funding that, and specifically around creating real value, not creating more money out of money that doesn't actually represent things, but the things that are actual abundance in circulation. And we want it to match community priorities. And this involves a lot of constituent leadership work, where our movements as a whole are learning more how we have to undo hierarchical power dynamics, where communities don't get to consent, let alone control how larger scale choices are being made. This actually needs to be led by those who are impacted by the change. This actually needs to be led by the communities that have been most oppressed under existing systems of money. Going to do a quick pause here. Please take a break and grab any water that you might need. Take a little stretch and find yourself in whatever space you need to be in to come back and dig into the rest of this presentation and conversation. All right, welcome back. We're hopping into the next section of currency property exploration, and this is how money leaves circulation. We just touched on the culture behind money, the history of that, as well as how money enters circulation. How money leaves circulation is also incredibly important for having lasting solutions. In current systems, we're going to start where we are and then lean towards what we can dream into and imagine. Who can destroy money? It's actually a felony to destroy money unless, again, you're a bank. Same way that creating money is a felony if you're just an individual. This is along the same lines. Banks actually eliminate the principal on a loan, the amount of a loan that's given, except for the interest on that loan when it's paid back. So I mentioned before how banks are issuing new money into circulation that didn't exist before whenever they're making a loan. As payments come back, that money is actually disappearing out of thin air. However, that money only leaves up to the point of the initial amount of the loan, and the interest is kept by the bank, even though they didn't issue that amount of money into circulation. What that effectively means is that for every loan that's made, more money has to be paid back than entered existence. So another loan has to be taken out by another person or in another place. It is a financial version of what we see in biology as addiction, a chemical dependency, or a dependency in general, where the more loans are made, the more accumulating total debt there is that requires more loans to be made to repay them. That builds debt on debt on debt. And at the current time of the last numbers that I looked up before giving this conversation, globally, we were at about 2.5 times the amount of debt as there is money in circulation. And 95 to 97% of that money in circulation is just digital imagined private bank credit. That's specific to the US dollar, but it's reflective of global systems where monetary policy follows a very similar property of being introduced by private corporations, by banks, for their own profit, where they control it and then they destroy it. It is then left out of circulation. It just leaves, it stops existing when it is paid back. And that is one of the only levers that monetary policy has for preventing chronic and ongoing inflation. Although ongoing inflation is stabilized as the norm within the current monetary policy framework, it's not necessary that that is a part of how currencies function, but it's the way that our current ones do. And it is dependent on this chronic addiction cycle within the monetary system as it's known. Again, this is something where looking into the international movement for monetary reform and branches that are individual to your locations and countries are something where you can learn a lot more about this particular pattern. It is specific to monetary reform and monetary justice, doesn't have as much to do with the properties of currencies as a whole, but it does have to do with the introduction and destruction of currency in its current form and wanting to change that. So it intersects and overlaps a lot. What's been the impact of this? I mean, we just talked through it's the whole system becomes dependent upon these institutions. And it's worth mentioning that government debt works very differently than bank debt. Government debt can theoretically go up to an infinite amount without defaulting, though there are major consequences of doing that, where debt is essentially mediated through bonds rather than through loans, where in essence the power is reversed, where it is people purchasing bonds that pay money to the government on the promise that they're going to get paid back more. And that more isn't invented out of thin air. It comes from another cycle of bonds. And the more people want to buy bonds, the less rewarding they are in general. The interest rates are lower, so people are getting paid more if there is less desire to buy bonds. And when a government has more likelihood to accrue more debt, that is when people are going to be a little bit more on the fence about buying those bonds. But then the interest rates on them go up, and when it gets more rewarding to buy bonds than other forms of investments, people are going to flock to that, and it has this cycle where money tends to be feeding back into that. It's a pretty big problem in the sense that it is accruing indefinitely, and payments on interest for those bonds are going to exceed all other government expenditures soon. That's an issue. It's a pretty big issue. It's also baked into how our current system works. And I believe that not just individuals and communities and organizers need to be looking at currency justice. It also needs to be something that policymakers are looking at when you're actually looking for long-term, non-inflationary, sustainable solutions for how you can mediate economic health in an ongoing way that adapts to real needs in real time without screwing the entire future over. So that is something where it's important to understand the differences in the dynamics. There's a lot of resources for being able to learn about that more in depth. However, I believe that one of the most exciting things to look at in currency justice is actually in this realm of how money can leave circulation. Because you think back to how money was invented and how it transitioned from being this, you know, medium of exchange that was grain, where you could eat it if you needed to, but it also wouldn't last forever. It would gradually decay over time. So people were more compelled to either spend it or utilize it. That changing to the permanent currencies, the metal-based currencies, eventually paper and now digital currencies, that transition from temporary to permanent tried to combine the function of a medium of exchange, which is something you trade value with, tried to combine that with a store of value, which is something that you save with. And those two functions of a currency or an asset are actually pretty different in how they mathematically work. But what's exciting is that everything that's part of the poverty line, the cost of living, everything that is a recurrent mandatory cost is the cost of the second law of thermodynamics. It's the cost of entropy in our physical universe, manifesting as an error, a mathematical error between the lifespan of real value and the lifespan of money. It is perfectly possible to make money that also slowly decays out of circulation, very feasible in a digital format, in a way that matches and cancels out all of the cost of living. Now, if you remember from market reinforced poverty, we need systems where basic well-being is handled outside of market pressures. All the rest we can do with supply and demand just fine because it's based on preference, not based on need. But when you're talking about needs, when you're talking about essential goods and services, the things that individuals and communities and ecosystems need to have a baseline of well-being that must be paid in any case in order for people and ecosystems to be well, those costs can be covered by introducing new assets of a currency to pay the people who are generating it, measure that introduction of real new value into the economy, and then gradually measure how that energy circulates through and be able to take money out, a small percentage of each dollar at a time, where you're not just paying it back. It's not just a different weird tax. You're actually measuring how much value there is in the whole economy, across the entire economy, by using digital assets that can be paid just like we're familiar with. You could go to a restaurant, get food, and as the recipient, it would be free. But as the provider, you are getting paid well for your work by introducing value into the economy, where it enters circulation by being eaten by someone, where it becomes productive energy and life force and effort, labor, care. You're measuring the fact that you have met someone's needs, and that becomes new wealth in circulation that is non-inflationary because it's able to circulate out at the same rate as real value circulates out. If we don't lean into this, if we don't change how basic needs are met, or if we keep trying to use currencies like the dollar or Bitcoin that last indefinitely, then at the very least, we're always going to have chronic inflation. But at the worst, and this is something that is dependent on how we're currently using currency, so it's necessarily baked in to this system as we use it now, survival will always mean having to pay off this artificial debt that is really just the difference in lifespan getting measured between a permanent currency and value that needs to be regenerated over time. It follows the way that natural systems flow. In our opening meditation, we not only connected with this sense of what restorative relationship is like, we also connected in with the flow of energy through our bodies and our ecosystems. The model for how this works is already made, it's already tried and true. It's been the only way that life has been able to survive over the course of time on Earth. And it's that new energy is entering. It's entering through sunlight into plants. In human economies, it enters through food and medical care and housing. It circulates throughout the community, it circulates through our bodies, it lives its lifespan as usable value in our economies. And then it does actually need to decay out of circulation. And that decay is real and is happening across every real part of our economy right now. But that cost is getting shouldered right now by working class individuals who are paying off the debt of entropy, an artificial debt that's just based off of physics. They're the ones having to pay that off over and over, rather than having a system where the currency itself is designed not to produce that debt in the first place, where you just cancel out that cost on both sides of the equation. Thinking forward, we can design so many different innovations in how this works. We can have, ideally, the priority of matching real energy flows with the energy flows throughout any given currency, whether it's local, national, international. Counteracting inflation is a unique opportunity of this particular shift as well, because having a permanent currency means that it's necessarily going to be losing value, or at the very least changing value over time, especially when more is constantly being introduced the way it is with our dominant currencies right now through our bank money creation scheme. Inflation has become both completely normalized in our current system, as well as it's become the motivating force for anyone seeking totalitarianism to be able to leverage for their benefit. Is they can say, I will fix this for you, or this is being caused by such and such an enemy group, or this is being caused by the poor policy of my political opponents. When really it's just baked into our system of money. We can bake a system of money where the game theory works for everybody, where that's not the case. You can have, I would imagine, the ideal situation is a currency where the standard unit of measurement stays the same today as it is in 100 years, which is meeting a person's needs for a day. Average person's needs, that's something where you've got a metric that is adaptive and person-centered. You can have it be distributed across basic needs in a way that mathematically reflects what is actually entering our human economy in a way that's relevant to the scale of how many needs are being met by that work. It makes it possible to scale a financial system that meets basic needs for free to match the needs of any number of people without producing a change in currency strength, because you can have the same amount entering in a person-centered way to meet this person's needs and have that be a particular small percentage of the total amount that's appropriate for the average expenditures of a human being in that amount of time. And then that's modular. And you can have that amount be added for everyone the system supports, and the percentage of it added for the percent to which it is meeting their needs. And it becomes a scalable system where any number of people can have all of their basic needs met for free without it coming at an additional cost to any individual or business. That's completely different from the mindset of how taxes work in our current system. And taxes and sales prices are currently the way that our system tries to compensate for that same gap in mathematics, that same artificial error of trying to use permanent currencies in a world where everything else is impermanent. And you also have the opportunity here to create naturally distributive currency technologies, where instead of having the graph that's produced of wealth distribution, where our current systems consolidate wealth in the hands of a few. The more money you have, the more returns you get on that money. This would actually be the inverse of that, where you've got, I'm not sure if using the word inverse is technically mathematically correct. It is the opposite of that in the particular sense that you have negative interest on any amount of money that is held stagnantly. You've got any percentage, you could even start at 2%, 2 to 3%, comparable with inflation. Have something that's an easy transition to one of these new currencies, where that is the amount that actively leaves circulation each year, and have that be the percent of that particular overall circulating supply of that currency, where it's entering the hands of the people who are generating real value, and where it accrues, that percentage is a larger amount. And so more is recirculating from the places where it accrues towards the places where it's needed, rather than things going at the cost of the people who need the most into the hands of the few, like currently happens in our systems. It reverses that pattern to be naturally distributive and to benefit the opportunity for more people to be able to make more wealth without even necessarily requiring any wealth-based tiered system of cost. It's just naturally distributive. And it gives us another opportunity to lean into what money is made to represent. We've got so many different pieces of our monetary system that are relatively obscure, where in the current context, we don't really know what value is behind money. There's a narrative about going back to a gold-backed system, which itself was not necessarily really entirely backed by gold, but to the point that it gave you something that you could exchange your money for in a reasonable amount. That was something that the myth was built out around as the transition was happening from metal currencies towards paper currencies, towards digital currencies. That piece of a backed currency is an important concept to think about, because we want to know what our money is backed by. What does it actually represent? And right now, in our current system, our money is entirely backed by debt. That is what it represents, that is how it flows, and that is what it's introduced to measure. It is produced as debt is produced, and as debt is eliminated, it is eliminated. It's entirely backed by debt. And it represents some of how money was first invented, where it was largely used as a mechanism of debt. The idea is that if you hold money, somebody owes you. Somebody owes you something. And it might be in 10 years, it might be in 5 minutes, but you could exchange it for that thing that they owe you. However, our currencies have another layer of debt in addition to that debt that's based on what you have provided to someone else. It's the layer of overall debt in the system as a whole. And that manifests both in terms of bank-created debt, as well as the debt that comes from the cost of entropy, like we just mentioned, where when you're holding a dollar, you are holding money that represents a bit of all of the economy. It's like a share of that larger economy. And as real value leaves that economy, That money has to be repaid in order for real value to be regenerated in actual circulation. It's not profitable for the holders of money to do that. And so it leads towards more and more people losing value and having less and less in this, again, the equation where it redistributes towards the wealthiest individuals more and more and more in an exponentially escalating way. So many impacts of this. Wealth inequality is huge, but also you can think theoretically about how having a currency that is effectively unbacked by anything leads us towards optimizing towards consumption, where you can generate more money by actually eliminating real value from circulation. The less abundance there is, the more profit a seller can make. The less security there is, the more profit a seller can make. It's inverse, where the more monetary value consolidates, the more monetary value is prioritized, the less real value can be prioritized. And the more real value can be prioritized, the less financial value can be prioritized. But we don't have to do that. We can have currencies that are backed by real measurable value instead of by debt. You can have a currency where you measure when there's more security, when there's more abundance, when there's more housing, when there's more food, when there's better education, when there's better health care, and when people have better access and equity, there's actually more money to represent that there is more abundance. There's more that can be traded to back that currency. There's more abundance across the economy to back that currency. You're not just constantly dreading that you're building an economy that's leaning into more and more and more debt that will eventually break, like our current systems. And you can have an economy that optimizes towards financial value, making it more profitable to actually benefit people and the planet the most. And you can have this be something that's linked with concrete data. There are ways that you can create a currency to literally measure how much of something there is. And that could be, in an isolated case, that could be an investment asset where people are able to literally invest in trees or in access to housing or in the prevalence of important socioeconomic data and the safety of that data. You can actually track that and measure that in something that people could invest in. And that's exciting. But it's also something where we have to look through, again, all of these four areas of currency justice. You've got to understand, what is the cultural assumption behind that? Are people privatizing collective liberation? Who gets the profit from that? Who gets to decide where it's introduced? Does it enter the hands of the most impacted communities? If it does, that could be amazing. If it doesn't, where is it going instead? How is it eliminated? What is, if any, the strategy for when actual value goes down in the world? Are people going to feel the loss in their wallets? And I argue that people should feel a loss in their wallets when there's a real loss in the world or in community. I think we need currency systems that are designed to internalize what currently are economic externalities. Another fancy, hard to understand word that basically refers to stuff that's not counted in the bottom line. Mental health, public health, racial equity, things that an employer or a government or a money-making individual can exploit for profit without consequence. But it is actually coming at a real cost to somebody somewhere. And that is important for us to measure in actual economic terms. Make a game where winning the financial game actually means the community wins. Combine our real priorities, what we actually value, with our systems of financial value. Thinking forward, this is a place for a lot of opportunity. You can integrate all of these pieces of what we've talked about and think about what is the meaningful backing value that you want to see behind your currencies. I would love to see ones that are backed by access to all of those components of a secure baseline of well-being, where less access means there's less abundance in the community. It's actually the fact. You're actually measuring that there is less abundance in the community. Why not have it also be reflected by the real pocketbooks of everyone who's a stakeholder in that collective decision making? Have a system where every individual's smartest financial choice is to benefit the whole in a way that the community has co-created and consented to. That's exciting to me. We want to have metrics of real security and abundance backing our currencies rather than having currencies that are backed only by debt. We want to match the impact of the systems we create with the actual priorities of the systems we create. And this, again, needs to be constituent led, led by the people who are most impacted and currently most oppressed. This is something where it needs to be a community-wide effort. It needs to have this lasting, deep, transformative impact on our systems, where instead of a rebranded form of business as usual, you're actually changing the game so that you've changed the optimal strategy for everyone who's playing it to match what we actually want to be doing in the world. You combine where you introduce money with these priorities, and you've then got a self-funding system that can self-scale as long and to whatever extent it is trusted and used by people to trade for the luxury things. Free for all necessities, and then however many people trust it enough to use it for everything else, it has the ability to scale to support that many people. It is really exciting that it can be a self-funding, self-scaling infrastructure. What leaves circulation is also a mechanism for connecting this form of empathy. You can literally have monetary empathy where when the world hurts, the pocketbook hurts. Where when real value is lasting longer in circulation, when people are doing better, when people are more secure, when there is less of an ongoing chronic public health crisis that's requiring incredible amounts of money to be poured in, your money actually decays at a slower rate, where you have greater wealth longevity when wealth longevity in the real economy is actually greater, or when abundance wants to be measured by greater wealth longevity. And it's an incredible balance when you're talking about spending pressure, because a shorter lived currency, you want to spend faster, which leads to inflationary pressures. But if it becomes longer lived, then there's more opportunity to save it, counteracting the inflationary pressure that would otherwise come from having more in circulation. You can then also have a system like this where you balance what's taken out of circulation between currency decay, that natural demurrage of a certain percentage coming out of circulation. You could balance that with a percentage coming out of transactions. And then you've got saving pressure versus spending pressure that can be balanced however it needs to for an appropriate amount in circulation to match either the wealth longevity you want correlated with the real abundance in the community, and or there's so many different ways to combine this and breathe life into what we might envision to fully stabilize the inflation and deflation of the currency at a system-wide level. Individual costs would change in individual locations, but overall you could keep a standard metric of currency value over any amount of time with a system like this. That's a lot of information. We have dived into a huge amount of content and we've only just scratched the surface of it. All of these properties are things that have to be very carefully considered. It's something that will be a long-term amount of change-making work that goes into doing it safely and well. But also there is the opportunity, and what excites me is there is hope. Even if individual places and groups might not be ready for something like this, there are people all over the world who are. There are even governments all over the world who are. And we can take what we've learned about the history and culture of money and build a future with it. We can take an understanding of how money is and can be created and create better systems with it. We can take our new knowledge about how money leaves circulation and could leave circulation, design entirely new strategies, and have money to represent what we authentically want to value. I really want to invite you to take your own leadership into how you would design the next generation of currencies and think systemically. Really think about who would be impacted, who is controlling it, how is power shared, how are decisions made, who gets to decide and how. We've learned a lot from what doesn't work. We've got a lot of opportunities in our movements to coordinate around best practices that people are building and have built for thousands of years. And a lot of the solutions, like we started with, are actually just going back to natural human relationship, the blueprints found in nature, and the intact economic function that is modeled by indigenous and pre-colonial societies, who should be at the helm again, while we need to be making these transitions at a local and global scale. We need to build these systems with inclusion and justice at the helm. Economic stress and the felt sense of scarcity have been weaponized against DEI and against movements for people to be equal. They've been weaponized for hate. And scarcity brings us into scarcity mindsets that do make us push against each other. This is abundance work. This is work where we have concrete reasons to hope. This is work where we know we will have ways to fund everything that needs to be done for global, equitable, fair transitions towards systems that work for the long term, where everybody has a basic right to all components of well-being as they choose to receive it in a way that they self-determine, where the communities that are involved in these programs and policies and currency systems have self-designed and consented to how they're designed to work. We can build this for the future. This could be done poorly. There will probably be many people and groups who try to do it without power sharing or without accessibility in the leadership. But there are enough people in our systems now who know that that's important for us to also have many, many, many places where we will do it right, where we will do it in a way where we are accountable to the impact, where everyone who is impacted is leading, where scope of impact never exceeds the scope of consent, and where we have changed the fundamental cultural assumptions that we need to in order to have restored relationships so that those relationships can be carried by a global scale of a system. It needs to be a movement, can't be led by any one individual. It's really important that it's shared. If you want to learn more, it's shared here. I share this for free, knowing that it is a very important piece of my own economic accountability, having gotten a lot of privilege without having earned it. It makes sense to do a lot of reparation for the world without it having to be something where I am compensated. The idea of equivalent exchange preserves wealth inequality. If you've got someone with a lot and someone with a little and you say there's always got to be equivalent exchange, that preserves wealth inequality indefinitely. There have to be acts of generosity within the transformation of our systems. And if there are ways where you find yourself in a position to be able to support this work, I want to continue it. I want to be able to dedicate more time to it. And I want to be able to offer my labor, time, and caring sharing with people who cannot pay because of the systems of oppression that we have to dismantle. So if you're in a place to support, please do. And I'm really excited to continue this work. Again, resources are available in the description of this video. I look forward to being able to collaborate. And I hope that this gives you hope. Thank you.